session on Microsoft Teams and, well, how Microsoft Teams interacts with on-premises mailboxes and how you can troubleshoot this situation. But first of all, shortly to me, so I'm Thomas Stensitsky. I'm an MVP for Office Apps and Services. In addition, I'm one of the 6 MCT regional leads for Germany. And you can contact me after the session for any other additional questions via Twitter, email, or just via one of my blogs, if you like. I do maintain a German-speaking blog and an English one. So let's dig into this because there we go. What are we talking about when it comes to Microsoft Teams and Exchange Server? As you might know, it's all about the calendar connectivity. So the calendar app that shows up on your application bar in Teams on the very left. And this simply shows your personal calendar of your inbox. Normally, this is the inbox of your Exchange Online mailbox. But for some reason, some companies tend to stay on premises when it comes to using Exchange Server mailboxes. So Microsoft Teams can connect to those mailboxes and can display the calendar, and it's still supported to create meetings, create delegate situations, and so on. But as you might assume, that supporting any issues that you might face to the on-prem connectivity, well, this is where it gets really tricky about it. So in addition to showing the calendar, even Teams is able to show you your planning assistant, so you can see any of those free busy times for your on-prem users, or if you're in a hybrid situation with your Exchange Online mailboxes. But how does this all work together? Because Microsoft Teams is a classic middle-tier solution where you have various clients. You have a desktop client for Mac operating system and even the beta version for Android, or the Windows version. You have mobile clients and you have the browser-based one. So the Teams clients connect to something in the Teams services world, which is cloud hosted in Microsoft 365. And they connect to something called the Teams calendar middle tier. And this again then connects to Exchange Online, Exchange on-premises, or to the scheduling service, which again provides other functionality. But again, it's all about connecting to your personal mailbox. And this is an architecture slide that I borrowed from a Microsoft presentation. And the thing that we are, oops, that was too fast. What we are now covering is just a little piece within this architecture of Microsoft Teams. So within the Teams services that are part of Microsoft 365. So I'm going to repeat myself just to make sure that you see that all the Teams functionality in the background is handled in the cloud service of Microsoft 365. And as you see, the backend services are the ones that are responsible for connecting and communicating with Exchange. And in this case, Exchange is just a word for Exchange Online or Exchange on-premises. So how does Microsoft Teams display your calendar? How does it find your personal mailbox? Any of those clients just connects to the Teams backend services, which then initiates a classic Exchange auto-discover request. And this request is always sent to Exchange Online, because Exchange Online is seen as a reliable source to the Teams backend services, providing the required information. So the assumption by the Teams backend services is that Exchange Online does have the knowledge about where is the Teams user's mailbox located. In the case that you are in a hybrid, you see you must be in some sort of a hybrid situation here. Then the Exchange Online returns a URL or telling the Teams backend services that your mailbox is not located in the service, but that the Teams backend services have to check with an on-premises URL. We will dig into this in detail a little later. This is just an overview slide for this process. So the second step, again, is an auto-discover recurse, because the Teams backend services in this step do not know which host name, which IP address to connect to fetch the user's inbox. So in step 3, after receiving the response from an on-prem Exchange server, in the third step, the Teams backend services are capable of connecting to the user's mailbox. This is one of the reasons why with an on-premises mailbox, it takes a little longer for displaying the calendar compared to users that have an Exchange online mailbox. So what is required to make this work? First of all, you need to have a Azure Active Directory Connect synchronization in place, or something we call a hybrid identity synchronization between your on-prem Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. But because the functionality for Microsoft Teams relates or relies on Exchange, it is required that Azure Active Directory Connect runs with the hybrid or Exchange hybrid option enabled, because otherwise the relevant user attributes won't be synchronized to Azure Active Directory. Well, and to make it work, the Teams user needs to have an assigned Teams license. It's a pretty simple requirement, but it is a requirement. The coexistence between Exchange Online and your on-premises Exchange service for making a Teams connectivity happen to your on-prem Exchange requires or only works with selected versions of Microsoft Exchange Server. So you must have Exchange Server 2016, CO3 or newer, which, to be honest, you should already been running on, because these are the minimum requirement is even not a supported CU anymore. So you should actually run the most current cumulative update for your on-prem Exchange servers. If you're still using an older version of Exchange, then you're out of the game. You must upgrade your on-prem environment first. Another requirement is that your on-prem Exchange infrastructure, your organization, is published, as we say, to the internet. So your on-prem Exchange organization must be reachable and accessible from the internet from Exchange Online and from the Teams backend services. And this requires that auto-discover and at least the Exchange web services endpoints are published. For some functionality of Microsoft Teams, you even need to have the REST endpoint published. Another requirement is that open authentication is established and configured between your on-prem Exchange and Exchange Online, which is normally handled when you bring your on-prem Exchange with Exchange Online into a hybrid configuration. This is normally handled by the hybrid configuration wizard. But if, for whatever reason, the hybrid configuration wizard is not capable of configuring your OAuth authentication, because, let's say, some network connectivity constraints from this system where you execute the HCW might interfere with creating the OAuth, or any other situation happens, the Exchange product group provides a very detailed documentation on how to establish this OAuth authentication manually. But what is the OAuth configuration in this case? So this is that Exchange on-premises recognizes Exchange Online as a trusted application and vice versa. And this is some sort of federation-based trust between the two organizations. As you might remember, Technically, we are talking about two different, so physically separated organizations that are logically being connected to work as a single exchange org, quote unquote. Because it's the same company using two different environments. And this is why we do all this hybrid configuration stuff and establishing trusted connectivity between those two environments. And this is something that is a base or a very basic requirement for using the Exchange service and Exchange Online in a secure manner. The on-prem authentication certificate plays a vital role in establishing this configuration because of the fact that the authentication certificate is a self-signed certificate. Some enterprises tend to remove and to delete all self-signed certificates from certificate store of service. This is a really bad idea for Exchange. So keep in mind that the authentication certificate is a very vital piece for an on-prem Exchange org, and that it is required for establishing a trust relationship with Exchange Online. So please never delete the on-premises authentication certificate, which is currently in use. Another things that we need to consider when it comes to OAuth configuration is that it defines that the intra-organization connector, which is part of the configuration, defines the discovery endpoint for the SMTP domains. And this means that if you are running an enterprise with multiple SMTP domains, then all of the primary SMTP domains in use must be part of this configuration. Because Exchange Online is always going to trust in the direction from Exchange Online to on-prem Exchange server, all those domains. The other way around is much simpler because your on-prem Exchange org simply trusts the tenant domain of your Microsoft 365 tenant. You can simply do a query on the service principal. So the open authentication establishes a trust relationship to the service principal for Exchange Online. And if you are interested, you can check this, and there are currently 289 service endpoints, service principals, so to speak, within Microsoft 365, which are primarily used within the service. So all of the applications that you just transparently use when you use Microsoft 365 rely on the same technology. And from Microsoft Teams perspective, there are roughly about 40 for Microsoft Teams alone. So what does it look like? This is just for information purposes. That's why I'm going to skip this. You see the PowerShell command net, which you can execute while connected to your Microsoft Online tenant using PowerShell. And this is the Office 365 Exchange Online service principal, which is part of the open authentication. Just for illustration purposes. So the documentation tells you to use the Azure Active Directory module, but sadly the PowerShell commandlets are part of the MS Online module. So please ensure that if you configure the OAuth configuration manually, that you install the most current version of the MS Online PowerShell module. Simply use a modern server or a client and operating system, use install module. So run a administrative PowerShell session, use install module MS Online, and you're good to go. So this is just a quick overview of what you need to do when you when you troubleshoot the OAuth authentication. It's just verifying that the MS service principal is correctly configured. We'll show you this in a moment. Just let me see, just go to here. The test connectivity website from Microsoft offers various tests for testing the connectivity into your on-premises Exchange organization. Please use the test connectivity website to run the tests and verify that the default and the standard behavior and the standard connectivity on-prem Exchange works as expected, because this is one of the basic tests that you need to do if you encounter any connectivity issues inbound to on-premises mailboxes. So how does it look like? As you can see in this screenshot, this is the service principal. This is a fixed name for each tenant, referring to the Office 365 Exchange Online service principal that we just saw a few slides back. And what I do in this PowerShell command, it is just fetching all the configuration for that service name. And this is where all of the URLs that the service principal uses are added. And your on-prem namespace, let's example, mail.company.com, those needs to be added to the service principal names for that service to make connectivity OAuth connectivity happen to your on-prem Exchange org. Which is, as you can see, this is what we saw in the previous screenshot, fetching the service principal, getting the principal itself, adding our namespace endpoint and an auto-discover URL, and then just writing that information back to the additional service principal. And this ensures that the Exchange Online service principal is capable for doing an OAuth authentication to your on-premises Exchange org. Which, as you might assume correctly, that if you make any changes to your namespace, you must either run the hybrid configuration wizard again or do those changes to the service principal on your own. The link at the bottom of the slide is then directly a link to the online documentation, which guides you through this process very detailed. Again, this is just a summary before we dig into the deep dive on how to troubleshoot the connectivity to Exchange Server. Again, we need to have Exchange Hybrid option enabled for Azure Active Directory Connect. Why this is required, we will see in a moment. Even though that the primary mailbox is located in your on-premises Exchange environment, Microsoft Teams uses something that's called shadow mailboxes. So this is not quite an official term, but think about a mailbox that you can't see and can't manage as an Exchange administrator for storing compliance relevant information used by the user in Teams. The auto-discover process for the Teams backend services connecting to on-prem do not correctly support any redirects. So this is the reason why it is required that each SMTP domain that is used for authentication as well requires a dedicated auto-discover endpoint, which makes it a little tricky. If you cannot utilize a SAN certificate, so a certificate which contains multiple names and multiple domains, for example, for a cost reason, you can utilize a construct where you use an edge router, so where you simulate those endpoints, which can even be then being utilized using Let's Encrypt, so certificates that comes at no cost. But let's dig into how to troubleshoot the connectivity. First of all, let's deep dive into the auto-discover process that the Teams backend services do when it comes to connecting to your on-prem Exchange. The auto-discover request is a so-called auto-discover version 2 request, which is a JSON-based request. You might remember that we have something like Autodiscover version 1, which is an XML-based request, or POX as we call it. So POX is the abbreviation for plain old XML. But the good thing about version 2 is it's an anonymous Autodiscover request. And that makes it pretty fast because we definitely skip any authentication step here. You might ask yourself, wow, there's an anonymous request. Isn't that a privacy or data security issue? Nah, it's not, because this request is not capable. So an anonymous request is not capable of fetching any personal data from the user. The anonymous request just fetches URLs or endpoint information. Right. So the Teams backend services, as mentioned before, see Exchange Online as the reliable source for information when it comes to gather information. Where is the mailbox located if a user opens the calendar app and wants to see his or her calendar? Well, Exchange Online checks the recipient type of the user that the request was addressed to. In this first example, it's a mailbox user, so the mailbox is located in Exchange Online, and Exchange Online returns the Office 365 endpoint for EWS. And as you can see, a green tick. This means we are finished. It's a mailbox in the cloud. Autodiscover is good to go to connect. The Teams backend servers are good to go to connect to the Outlook EWS endpoint and fetch the mailbox data. But we are talking about mailboxes on-prem, so this is not the step that we are looking for. In this case, Exchange Online must know that the user has an on-prem mailbox. And this is done by having a synchronized user object in Exchange Online, which indicates that the user is a mail user. So a user object that is known by Exchange Online and contains the information that the user object does have an on-premises mailbox. So in this case, Exchange Online gathers the auto information and returns a HTTP redirect. So this kind of redirect is supported. It's just the redirect from Exchange Online to on-prem to the final target URL for the user. So we do an Autodiscover version 2 request to your on-prem org, which returns the address of the on-premises endpoints for EWS, if request is for EWS, or for the REST endpoint. And the final connectivity to that endpoint, this is where authentication will happen. But with the return of the EWS or REST URL, the Teams backend service have all the required information. So you see in detail that this process requires much more time than just a simple request to Exchange Online. Well, what can we do to troubleshoot this? The local Teams client trace does not help in this case, but because the Autodiscover v2 is anonymous, we can do a simple self-test, because you can simply connect to the internet. Why I mean to the internet is if you are doing this from an on-prem or within the company. So if you're in the company LAN connected and company network connected, you might not get a proper response, right? So in this case, we just simply do an Autodiscover JSON request for a target email address. Send this to the Office 365 endpoint, and we will get either the Office 365 endpoints or your on-prem endpoint. This is a simple address to see if for the given email address, Exchange Online does have the correct information and provide the proper information. So you can do this by PowerShell or from within a browser. You see, it's just the same. You can simply query for a given protocol, EWS or REST. Those are the two protocols used by Teams by the Teams backend services when connecting. If you encounter any issues, you might use Fiddler and do a Fiddler trace while you run the both command is either in PowerShell or just open the URL in a browser to see if, for example, if the TLS connection cannot be established, or if you receive a bad HTTP header or whatsoever, just to get into the details of the request itself and see if you get the proper information. Now, a little diagram before we head into the functional request by Microsoft Teams, because we need to know how Exchange Server works. It sounds pretty simple if you only see the connectivity from the Microsoft Teams backend services to our Exchange Server. But Exchange Server itself is, say, a complex product, which is not necessarily the best product to troubleshoot when you have to troubleshoot these HTTP requests from the Teams backend services. As you can see, your incoming request from via HTTPS hits the EWS, the public EWS endpoint in the IIS instance of the client access front end. You might know that modern Exchange servers have a front end and a back end, or so-called mailbox role. And we are still in the front end, and we already have two different log files populated for this single request that comes from Microsoft Teams backend services. The first is the IIS instance, the classic IIS protocols. The next one is the EWS request, which then ends up in the EWS proxy request. I just go to the next steps. So then is proxied to the next IIS website on the very same server, ends up again in IIS protocol files and the EWS log for the backend. You see that a single request from Teams ends up in 1, 2, 3, 4 different log files that you need to check if there are any connectivity issues for certain users, or in general that, like for example, that your Exchange log is not accessible for the Teams backend services. This is the example if front end and back end are on the same server. If you have multiple Exchange servers in place, your request hits server A, but, normally, sorry for that one, ends up on another server. So you have the log files of server 1 and 2 on server A, and log files for server 3 and the log files for request 3 and 4 on server B, C, or D, which makes troubleshooting a very tedious process. So if your auto-discover returns an unexpected EWS or REST URL, what could be the reasons? For example, you know that the user does have an on-premises mailbox, but your request returns an Exchange Online URL. In that case, most likely, the synchronized user in Exchange Online got an Exchange Online license assigned, and Azure ID Connect was not set and run using the Exchange hybrid option. This is a classic situation where the single user object, a synchronized user object, ends up with a mailbox in the cloud and a still active mailbox in on-premises. Solution to this resolves the duplicate mailbox situation, which is pretty well documented because it's a classic error that even happens without any team interaction. It's something that just happens due to a license assignment that happens too early. Another issue might be that you receive so auto-discover can connect to your on-premise Exchange org, but you receive a URL that looks like something like a on-prem or local URL, so like an internal URL. In that case, check all the external URL properties of all virtual directories on all Exchange servers and set the external URL attribute correctly. In this example, I just talk about EWS. This relates to the REST endpoint as well. So it's very important that all external URLs attributes are set correctly across all existing Exchange servers. Oh, duplicate slide. That looks good. Another thing is that if you are in a multi-Active Directory site environment, so a larger Exchange organization, you might see an issue that, as an example, you expect that the mailbox, because mailbox is located in an Active Directory site named EMEA, you have a dedicated namespace for this, but Autodiscovery turns the region for Asia and Pacific. In that case, you run on an older cumulative update for Exchange server, because previous CUs Exchange was not site aware, so the Autodiscovery v2 was not site aware and just returned an external URL on a random basis. In this case, update your Exchange environment to the most recent cumulative update, because this issue was fixed, as far as I remember, with the December CU, so the December 2020 cumulative updates. So if this issue occurs, please update your Exchange environment and the error is gone. So this was everything about Autodiscover, but now we talk about the calendar application access to the mailbox. How does this work? So after the backend services have retrieved the EWS URL as part of the Autodiscover request, the Teams backend services authenticate to your on-prem Exchange org, send an EWS request to fetch the calendar data. You get a reply. The middleware transfers the data to the application, and we are good to go. Calendar, please. Okay, what do we do if this does not work out as expected? In this case, first of all, let's check the obvious. Or is the host name returned by Autodiscover correctly resolvable by DNS from the internet? That's something that we check as a first step. It's pretty simple. Open up a browser that is connected on a computer that is simply connected to the internet, again, not to your internal company network. Open the URL. You should get a response with a 401, so a not authenticated response, and then just queries you to enter the credentials to connect to this endpoint. If you cannot run this test, there's on the test connectivity test website, there's a dedicated test for this. So use the Teams calendar tab test on testconnectivity.microsoft.com and enter the credentials and then take a look at the results. If your firewall restricts the access to your on-prem Exchange organization to the IP address space from Microsoft 365, so Exchange Online and the networks from Microsoft Teams. To make this test work, you must add the dedicated IP addresses from the test connectivity website to your inbound firewall rule. The IP addresses are documented on the very same website in the release notes. Just scroll the release notes to the May 2020 release notes, and there are dedicated IP addresses. The team responsible for the test connectivity website is something work in progress that at a certain point the request might come from the official Exchange Online spaces, but this is not the case currently. If you still encounter issues, use the test auth connectivity commandlets from your on-prem Exchange org, and then verify the service principal names, the connector information that we've already talked about, and the authentication server settings, that those are correctly set and configured and using the correct certificates. Calendar activity wouldn't be complete with a delegate information, with a delegate functionality, even Teams. So simply think about a manager and a delegate situation where the delegate is responsible for setting up Teams meeting for the manager in the manager's calendar. This is something that works from within Outlook. So this is something that does not work from within the Teams client, because you normally see just your personal, you normally see your personal calendar. But if you're on opening the calendar of a delegate, you can simply create a new Teams meeting. And again, we will see how this process then works. The interesting thing is that you must use the Outlook delegate wizard to configure another person as a delegate. So the Outlook delegate wizard is where in Outlook you just open the back pane, say delegates, and then this is where you select and assign the permissions for your calendar. It is not sufficient to, let me see, it's not sufficient to assign a permission directly in the folders view of Outlook. Why this is the case, we will see. So this is the sequence, what happens. The delegate clicks in the Outlook button bar on new Teams meeting. The add-in itself connects to the Teams middle tier in this case. And the Teams middle tier just uses the auto-discover process to find the delegate's calendar endpoint. That's something that we are currently already familiar with. Then fetches information from the manager's calendar using a get delegate request. So it fetches the list of delegates, and this is why you must use the Outlook delegate wizard to assign another person as a delegate. Assigning a permission on a folder does not make the person a delegate for your calendar. It might be able to, the person might be able to access the calendar in Outlook, but it is not officially, technically a delegate. So, and in terms with the information on the delegate list and the permissions, then creates the required meeting information and simply returns this information to the Teams add-in, which in part then add this information to the meeting information within Outlook. So pretty simple for the end user, pretty heavy stuff in the back end going on, and with decent requirements on how delegate permission is assigned. Well, the simplest test is if the delegate, quote-unquote delegate, does not have the proper permission assigned, a Teams throws or shows an error, or the Teams add-in shows an error in Outlook that the user does not have the proper permissions, and queries the user to get in touch with the manager to get delegation permission properly assigned. There's an open source client available, the so-called SOAP-E client, which you can download and use to run a get delegate query on your own for the given mailbox. And in addition, you can do a filter trace. When you receive a 4 or 3 error, you will see that this is the error code, which then triggers the non-permission command, and which again is a proof for you as an administrator that there is a permission issue in the manager delegate situation. Interestingly enough, the test connectivity website does offer a remote test for this functionality as well. So there's a Teams meeting delegation test available. Here, the same constraints that apply as mentioned before. The IP addresses from the test connectivity website must be able to make a connection to your on-prem Exchange servers. If it looks, so any of those tests look good, or you do not know what, but it still does not work, then you are required to dig into the EWS log files or the Exchange log files to identify the root cause, especially when you receive this error message that Teams is currently not able to connect to your server. Please try again later, might not solve itself by trying it again later. In this case, you remember the slide that I showed you how Exchange works. Then you must see, does the request comes to my firewall? How does it look like in my reverse proxy? How does it look like in the first IIS on the server? Is there any other active network device in place? I go just network trace. So there might be some active, I call them, so actively interfering network devices in the network flow from the internet through the firewall to the perimeter network, to the internal network, to the Exchange servers. If there are any actively interfering devices in place, I recommend take a closer look at those, especially if there is some sort of a layer 7 user agent filtering in place, which should be disabled and or bypassed. It does not, so user agent filtering does not provide it's not a security feature. Yeah, it's just something that makes application not work as expected. Security comes from a totally different approach, so to speak. But again, you must identify and you must know all the steps between the Teams backend services and your Exchange servers, which is in larger enterprises a tricky thing, because if those components are dispersed across various teams, it boils down to those teams must work together to identify the root cause. So it gets tricky. Teams can set your presence status based on your calendar appointments and meetings. It will set the presence to in a meeting if you have a meeting in your schedule. The information for this is not fetched using EWS, but using the REST API endpoint. And the Teams client itself communicates with the presence service in the backend every 6 minutes to get information about should I update the status based on the calendar. Now the presence service is responsible for then communicating or fetching the data from the mailbox. This is where it gets really bad for mailbox users with a mailbox on premises. Oops, because we do have two modes available here. We do have the pull mode, so which is only executed once an hour, where the presence service pulls information from the calendar. And there's a push mode where the presence service subscribes to the Exchange mailbox and then gets the information subscription-based to update or to react on any changes that are proposed to the presence service. Again, with the on-premise Exchange server, we have only pull mode available. This is the reason why the automatic setting of the presence in Teams is delayed, and sometimes when it's observed by end users, which, well, I wouldn't necessarily say that it drives them crazy, but you as an IT staff will get requests on why is the presence not currently set based on my calendar. Again, how's the sequence determining the data? It's pretty simple. We do the auto-discover request for the REST URL. The REST endpoint is behind the API virtual directory. So we do a connectivity to the API virtual directory doing OAuth. And the present service tries to create a subscription. It just simply tries, and this runs in an error. It gets an error that RPC endpoint cannot be found. And this is where then the team services simply do a fallback for doing a fallback into pull mode. So what can we do if the API URL is not available? Again, name resolution, doing a fiddler trace. And again, we have a support from the product group teams here. So the test connectivity website does provide a test for this. This request to the API endpoint failed until December 2020 due to a misconfiguration of the web.config for the REST endpoint, which again was fixed if you have installed December 2020 cumulative updates. If not, if for any reason you have not installed it yet, and there are valid reasons to stay with the previous cumulative update, a hidden slide in this deck just describes which configuration you must update within the web.config. Compared to the calendar access, you must verify the REST protocols on your Exchange service, so proxy and IIS front end. And again, this is something due to the requests or the nature of the request, because they have it's a very long request, so to speak. Check that user filtering is disabled as well, and that the request passes and travels and traverses through all network components from your firewall to your internal Exchange org. There are some protocol files available on the Teams client. This is just for information purpose. If you have any client-related issues that you see, you can, these log files are stored in the app data folder of the given user. But there is a functionality in the desktop and the web client, how a user can simply create and gather the log information just by using the string alt shift +1 at the same time. This creates a package of the required log files, and the files are then downloaded and stored by the client in the downloads folder of the user. So if you have to support Teams and you do not know what's going on, just ask the affected user to gather information, send it to you, and take a look before you do any kind of a remote session with that user. Are there any other things that you need to be aware of when you use on-premises mailboxes with Microsoft 365? So first of all, Microsoft Teams can only connect to your personal calendar. But there are other things you need to be aware of, because to-do and bookings do not work with on-premises mailboxes. So if you want to utilize those two features, so those products and functionality from Microsoft 365 with personal mailbox, this won't work. So you need to migrate the user mailboxes to Exchange Online so that to-do can work across with the activities and tasks lists within the mailbox. And bookings is something that just simply does not connect and interacts with on-premises mailboxes. Any questions, though?
Hello, Thomas.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so there is a question actually. So Rob's asked the question, doesn't the hybrid configuration wizard usually take care of the endpoint management? I think he was asking that question at the time you were showcasing configuring the on-premise.
Yes, normally it does, but normally means that you prepared your the Exchange Online and your on-prem org before configuring or before running and executing the hybrid configuration wizard. Meaning that you already tested the inbound connectivity from test connectivity to your Exchange org, right? So you prepared your on-prem Exchange org, tested it using test connectivity before running and executing HTW. There might be situations where, because how does HTW work, right? It's just a simple application connecting to your on-prem org and Exchange Online using remote PowerShell at the same time. And there might be situations where the outbound connectivity from the machine where you run and execute the hybrid configuration wizard runs into issues connecting and configuring Exchange Online, right? But luckily enough, HTW provides a very extensive log file which tells us what broke and why it was not able to configure this, but the log file contains even the PowerShell commandlets that it tried to execute. This is where you again troubleshoot if OAuth did not, or the HTW had not configured OAuth correctly.
Very interesting, very interesting, Thomas. This is really, a lot of this is news to us, right? So we really appreciate the insight that you're providing here on the platform. Yeah,
you're welcome. This is why I just had to stay with screenshots, which I normally do not like, but this is in an online presentation. I do not rely on the service for online demos to some extent, right? It's just failing online demos is a bad thing. That's why I stay with screenshots. It makes the presentation slightly boring, but it's deep dive content, so.
Great stuff, Thomas. So are there any other questions before we break up for our lunch break, 1 hour lunch break? Any other questions? So Thomas, could you share your contact details in the chat window so that the attendees can keep in touch with you and follow you?
Absolutely. I will add those to the chat in a moment.
And could you share some information about these publications as well?
These are two German-speaking publications. This is about Exchange Server 2019 and another about Exchange Server vNext, or quote unquote, the last Exchange server is currently in preparation. And the other one is focusing on Microsoft 365 Business, which is the translated version from the Microsoft 365 Business Migration and Configuration book by Alex Fields, where I am a co-author for the English version of this publication. So if you use a search engine of your choice, using for Microsoft 365 Business Migration and Configuration book, then you will end up either at the English version by Alex Fields and me, or by the German translated one.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, so there aren't any other questions. So I'd like to thank you, Thomas, for taking your Saturday out today to share your years of experience with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Thomas. So that was Thomas Zdinsky, all the way from Germany. Microsoft R&D, regional lead in MCT. So it's a great privilege to finally